They called him a rock in the storm. Father Gabriel Moreau wasn't a man who demanded attention when he entered a room. He didn't need to. The calm in his eyes said enough. The discipline in his posture, the way his voice never rushed, he exuded the kind of quiet authority people trusted without question. For 14 years, he led the congregation of St. Augustine's Parish in upstate New York. He baptized the newborns, buried the dead, comforted the grieving, and married the hopeful. His hands were on every chapter of this town's story. To the people of St. Augustine, Father Gabriel wasn't just their priest. He was their constant, their compass, the man who never wavered, never stumbled, never strayed. But constancy is not the same as invincibility. And behind the pulpit, behind the robe, behind the carefully measured words, Gabriel was a man at war with silence. He had chosen the priesthood young, not out of blinding revelation or divine thunder, but as an escape from a life he couldn't control, from the chaos of love, the hunger of ambition, the wounds of youth that never healed right. The collar gave him rules, the church gave him purpose, the rituals gave him rhythm, and for a long time, it was enough. He never married, never dated, never confessed to any real temptation. His sermons were never dramatic. He preferred parables over fire, wisdom over warning. But there was a gravity to his presence, a kind of sacred restraint that made people feel safe. Still, if you looked closely, you might have noticed it. The way his hands trembled slightly after service. The way he stared a second too long at the sunset through the stained glass. The way his smile never quite reached his eyes anymore. By his mid-40s, Father Gabriel had become a man living entirely for others. So long, in fact, that he'd forgotten how to live for himself. He had buried the chaos, but also the joy, and something inside him had begun to rust. It was a slow unraveling, the kind of quiet decay that no one notices until the beam snaps and the ceiling falls. He still stood at the pulpit each Sunday, still bowed his head over hospital beds, still offered bread and wine like it was salvation. But inside, something stirred. Something he had buried years ago beneath vows and Latin prayers, a memory of what it meant to feel, to be wanted, to be seen not as a vessel of grace, but as a man of blood and breath and longing. He didn't know what he was missing until the day she walked into confession. It was a Thursday. Overcast skies, rain tapping gently on the chapel windows. He had just finished morning mass and was preparing his homily when the light came on in the confessional. He stepped inside, expecting routine. Instead, he met the sound of a woman's breath, tight and trembling. No words, just silence. Raw, vulnerable silence. Then came her voice. "Father, I don't know how to begin." And neither did he. That moment, so small, so unremarkable in the eyes of the world, would be the first ripple in the flood. Because Father Gabriel Moreau, the rock of St. Augustine, the man who never faltered, was about to fall. Her name was Claire Donnelly, and from the moment she stepped into the confessional, she didn't feel like a stranger. She felt like a warning, the kind you don't recognize until it's too late. Claire had arrived in town quietly, 3 months before that first confession. She took over the faded flower shop on Willow Street, the one with dusty windows and ivy choking the sign. Under her care, the place bloomed again, almost overnight. Roses in the window, lavender hanging from the doorframe, bouquets wrapped with twine and intention. People noticed, but no one really knew her. She told the grocer she was recently divorced. She told the pharmacist she was just starting fresh. She didn't tell the priest anything until that Thursday. Sitting behind the screen, her voice didn't tremble the way most penitents did. It wasn't shameful. It was tired. "Father," she said, "I'm not here for forgiveness. I'm here because I don't know how to carry silence anymore." That line lodged itself deep into Gabriel's chest. She returned a week later. Then again. And again. Each time she unraveled a little more. Not sins, exactly, though she called them that. What she offered instead were pieces of herself, her grief, her rage, her hunger for something she couldn't name, things she hadn't told anyone else, not even God. She spoke of nights that stretched like years, of a child she never got to hold, of a marriage that taught her how to vanish, one small compromise at a time. Father Gabriel said little. That was his role, after all. But his silence was different now. It wasn't spiritual. It was haunted. He found himself anticipating her voice, the way a thirsty man anticipates rain. Her stories clung to him long after she left. He began walking past the flower shop for no reason. He began noticing colors again, how the sunrise looked against the chapel roof, how the smell of lilies followed him into prayer. One afternoon, she left behind a scarf on the pew. He didn't mean to keep it, but he did. It stayed folded in his drawer, hidden between liturgical notes and old baptism certificates. And some nights, God forgive him, he would take it out, just to feel its softness, just to remember something real. Weeks passed, seasons shifted. Claire began volunteering at the church. At first it was innocent. She offered to arrange the altar flowers, to polish brass, to fold bulletins. Gabriel agreed without hesitation. Or rather, he agreed without thinking. It felt safe, familiar. But it wasn't. She didn't sit at the back of Mass anymore. She sat in the second pew, close enough that he could see her eyes when he preached. Eyes that listened differently. Not to the sermon, but to him. The town didn't notice. Not yet. And maybe he told himself it was harmless. A priest helping a lonely woman. A woman helping a tired priest. But one night, Claire lingered after Vespers. She was lighting candles. He approached to thank her, and for a moment they stood too close, breathing the same air, saying nothing. She looked up at him, and he saw it. The question in her gaze. Not an invitation, not a plea, a question. And in that quiet, holy space, Father Gabriel didn't run, he just blinked. And that was enough, because some doors don't slam open. They drift open slowly, and damn you just the same. There was no thunder, no lightning, no divine warning echoing through stained glass. Just a Tuesday afternoon. Cloudy. Still. Claire brought coffee to the rectory. A small gesture. A paper cup with his name scrawled in ink. "Thought you could use a break," she said, her smile tucked between guilt and longing. He thanked her. Took it with trembling hands. They stood in the hallway, just a few feet apart, pretending there was nothing strange in the air. But silence has a weight to it. And the silence between them had become unbearable. "Do you ever feel," she began, eyes lowered, "like no one really knows who you are?" Gabriel stared at the crucifix on the far wall. "Yes," he whispered. That was all it took. The following days blurred into each other. They never made a decision. Not out loud. There was no spoken consent, no unraveling monologue about temptation or danger. Instead, there were glances that lingered too long, conversations that ended with unfinished thoughts, accidental touches that neither pulled away from. It was subtle, the kind of intimacy that blooms in shadow. One evening, After a late choir practice, Claire returned to the rectory under the pretense of returning a borrowed book. It was nearly 9 p.m., the church long emptied, its pews silent. He opened the door. She stepped inside. For a while, they stood in the hallway like strangers again, caught between sacred duty and unbearable want. Then she reached for his hand. It was the simplest thing. But when their fingers met, the weight of everything, of vows, of God, of who they once were, fell away. They kissed, softly, briefly, desperately. Not like lovers in heat, but like people drowning who found air in each other. When they parted, neither spoke. Claire left without looking back, and Gabriel stood there for a long time, alone in the dim light of the hallway, his collar still around his neck, his hand still shaking. That night, he tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down he already knew. He had opened a door that could never be closed again. What followed wasn't passion. It was erosion. He began to forget his own rhythms. His sermons became disjointed. He skipped morning prayers, snapped at the altar boys, stared too long at nothing. And yet, when he saw her, something inside him came alive. She wasn't a distraction. She was a mirror. In Claire's presence, Gabriel saw himself clearly for the first time in years. Not as a priest, not as a symbol of virtue, but as a man who had been starving. Starving for connection. Starving for meaning. And now he was feeding that hunger with borrowed moments and broken rules. They didn't speak about what they were doing. There was no label, no future plan. Just moments. Stolen ones. A brush of hands as she passed him the offertory basket. A glance during Mass that lasted 1 second too long. A note left between pages of a hymn book. And the world remained unaware. But secrets are never truly silent. They hum beneath the surface. They crackle in the air. And eventually, someone listens. One evening, Gabriel returned to the rectory to find a single envelope on his desk. No name. No return address. Just a sentence typed on an old machine. Ask him what happens after choir practice. His hands trembled as he read it again. Outside, the sky began to darken. And he knew. The door they had opened was now letting everything in. It was never supposed to be this. Not betrayal. Not ruin. Not scandal whispered through hymns and hollow glances. They had told themselves it was human. That it was grief seeking comfort. That it would end before anyone got hurt. But sin rarely waits for permission. It only waits for opportunity. After the letter arrived, Father Gabriel didn't sleep. He sat alone in the rectory office, lights off, the envelope folded and unfolded in his hands. He stared at it like it could somehow undo itself. The next morning, he called Claire. No answer. He tried again. Nothing. By evening, she was gone. The flower shop was shuttered. The closed sign hung askew in the window, and inside, the flowers had already begun to wilt. No goodbye, no note. Just absence, like she had evaporated. Gabriel stood there for several minutes, watching the reflection of his collar in the shop window. That night, he gave Mass with a heart that felt like a war zone. He fumbled his words, his voice cracked during the Lord's Prayer. And when he held up the communion wafer, his hands shook so violently he nearly dropped it. Some of the older parishioners looked concerned. The younger ones just looked confused. No one said a word. But the silence in the room was different now. He could feel it in his bones. The bishop called him the next day. "We received a letter," the voice said, formal and cold. "There's no proof, of course, but there's concern. And where there's concern, there must be clarity." Clarity. Gabriel nearly laughed. What was clear anymore? He asked for a few days, claimed exhaustion, promised reflection. The bishop agreed. 3 days later, a second envelope arrived, this time slid under the church door. A photo, grainy, taken through glass. Claire, Gabriel, a kiss in the side hallway behind the organ loft. It wasn't graphic, it wasn't even romantic, but it was undeniable. The proof had come. That Sunday was his last sermon. He wrote it late into the night, tossing out page after page, searching for something that didn't sound like an apology or an excuse, something that wouldn't make a mockery of the pulpit or the God he had once believed he served without fracture. He settled on a single scripture, Matthew 26:41. Watch and pray, that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. He didn't interpret it. He just said it. And then he stepped down from the altar for the final time. He turned in his keys, packed up his books, folded his vestments with trembling care. When the bishop arrived to meet him, Gabriel didn't argue. He didn't defend. He didn't explain. He simply said, "I lost the boundary between the sacred and the human, and now I don't know where I belong." The bishop looked at him with disappointment. Yes, but also with something else. Pity. That night, Gabriel walked the length of the sanctuary alone. The candles were still burning, their flames flickering in time with the ache in his chest. He knelt before the altar where he had once given weddings, blessings, last rites. And he wept, not just for the sin, not just for Claire, but for everything the church had taken from him, and everything he had given willingly. When he rose, his knees ached more than usual, and something in him had gone silent. Not defeated, just hollowed. The fire had consumed what it came for, and all that remained now were ashes waiting to settle. They didn't burn him at the stake. They didn't drag him through the town square. There was no mob, no fire, no fury, just silence, which, in a town like St. Augustine, cuts deeper than any sword. Gabriel Moreau vanished like an unwanted ghost, his name scrubbed from the bulletin, his voice erased from the pulpit. Parishioners avoided saying his name not out of malice, but out of discomfort, as if uttering it might summon shame too heavy to carry. No one mentioned Claire, either. She became a rumor, a whisper, a warning mothers used to caution their daughters about emotional men in robes. Gabriel spent a month in a borrowed guest room at a Franciscan abbey upstate. It was quiet, cold, the kind of place meant for reflection or exile. He swept stone floors, prepared bread for monks who never asked questions, and every morning, before the sun rose, he stood in the chapel, not to pray, but to listen. He was listening for something, God, perhaps, or maybe just forgiveness. But the silence remained, not cruel, just indifferent. One morning, a visiting novice asked him, "Were you always a priest?" Gabriel smiled, a sad, cracked thing. "No," he replied. "Once, I was a boy who thought God was a shelter." The novice didn't understand. How could he? Because shelter, Gabriel had learned, is not the same as safety, and love is not the same as redemption. By winter, the abbey offered him a permanent role, groundskeeper, part-time liturgical aide. No preaching, no collar. He accepted, because what else was left? Some nights, he wrote letters to Claire, never mailed them. He didn't know where she had gone. Boston, maybe, or nowhere at all. The truth is, she had become a part of him in a way more permanent than memory. Not as a lover, not even as a sin, but as the moment the mirror cracked, and he finally saw himself clearly. A man who wanted too much from too little. A man who mistook vulnerability for salvation. And yet, strangely, even now, even in disgrace, he didn't hate her. Because love, real love, is not always clean. Sometimes it ruins you, but sometimes it wakes you up. Back in St. Augustine, they repainted the confessional. New wood, new cushion. The bishop appointed a younger priest with a booming voice and perfect posture. The pews filled again. The choir sang louder. The bulletins never missed a date. But for those who had once watched Gabriel Moreau stand at the altar, hands trembling as he lifted the host, something remained. A flicker, a question, a sadness that never quite left the room. Because when a man falls from grace, he does not just fall for himself. He drags the faith of others down with him. Years later, someone left a small cross at the steps of the flower shop. Rusted, handmade, wrapped with a blue silk scarf. No note, no name, just a symbol. And maybe that's all a story like this leaves behind. Not a moral, not a clean ending, but a scar.